We're here to talk open source software with three incredibly different people from three incredibly different companies. I would even argue that the difference is apparent in these three panelists, and their presence here today shows just how much open source software and the idea of open source has changed in recent years. You'll see as we bring them out. First, Phil Dibowitz, who's a production engineer at Facebook. Phil has a cheering section here in the front. This could be because he oversaw the development of the configuration management system at Facebook, something he says took up 3 years of his life. So he knows Chef well and knows open source well. Next is Jeff Arcuri, who oversees infrastructure. Jeff oversees infrastructure at the Gap. So that means he oversees the Gap.com, BananaRepublic.com, as well as OldNavy.com.
Yep.
And lastly, Mark Rusinovich, who is the Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft Azure. Mark not only oversees the design of Azure, but he's a published novelist. 3 techno thrillers you should all read, and a short story as well. But let's get into the open source stuff. Phil, let's start with you because, I mean, just to set the stage, Facebook is an open source company in the extreme. I was saying backstage, I can't think of another company that kind of embodies the notion of open source. So maybe you could explain to the audience, first of all, just what the company's general attitude is towards that, how far it goes,
yeah.
And we can go from there.
Sure. So I'll start with an anecdote. When I was looking for my next challenge, Facebook had been recruiting me for a while, and I was like, social networking, bah. And I was at another conference, and they'd been talking to me for a while. And one of the recruiters wanted me to talk to David Ricordan, who recently left Facebook to go work for the White House. And he at the time was the director of open source. Director of open source, I think was his title. And I was like, well, the hell does that mean? And he was like, my job is to walk around and tell people, hey man, that's not our core competency. You should open source that. And I was like, I'll take the job. So that was the main reason I went to Facebook. And when I got there, in addition to sort of the memcache work we were doing and the kernel work we were doing and the MySQL work we were doing and all of the open source work that was sort of public and common that I'd known about from research, one of the first people I met at Facebook was the team that was working on taking all of our server designs that we had been working on forever and open sourcing all of it as hardware. The CAD files, working with OEM vendors so that people could go out and buy them. And I was just like, this is the company I was born to work at. And I think a lot of people in here are probably familiar with HHVM. We didn't want to rewrite our entire site, which was in PHP, in another language to be faster. So we wrote originally a PHP to C++ compiler and then used GCC. And now it's a JIT VM for PHP. And we work with the Zen community to make sure that PHP, we're involved in the actual PHP community and we're not like off in a corner doing our own thing. So I think sort of from hardware to the server platform to all of our tooling, we try and open source as much as possible. We think about open source. I think most teams, probably not every team, there's always an exception, but I think most teams try to think about open source from the get-go. How can we use open source? If we can't use open source, how can we open source what we do make internally? And I try, and as do many other people at Facebook, I am not alone in this, to continue to be that ambassador as we grow, right? It's hard to keep culture. So we try to be the ambassadors and remind people that this is important and this is who we are and this is what makes us powerful and this is what makes us a member of the community. So.
And Jeff, people might not think of the Gap as an open source company, but in ways you are as well, right?
Yes, we're big consumers of open technology and tools. Gap has a software development company living inside. We write a lot of our own code, but we certainly embraced open technologies. It's driving our monitoring, our virtualization platforms, you name it, on our big data platforms, and everything is being managed and configured by Chef. So we've embraced up and down the stack and across the business.
And Mark, I guess it's safe to say that for many years, Microsoft was sort of held up as the arch enemy of open source, but nowadays it's a very different company in terms of open source. No?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been at Microsoft for 8.5 years, and I've seen the transformation happen during that time, especially in the last few years. It's really accelerated. But Microsoft, like you say, didn't have a long tradition in open source, and so this transformation is a lot of learning, and learning all the different places where we can adopt and use and embrace open source, from everything from us using open source internally. Again, like Facebook, why do we have to build everything ourselves? We should take advantage of what's out there and then contribute back as well. An example of that would be our use of Storm internally, which then we made a public service out of as well. Embracing the open source ecosystem to bring people onto our platform so that they can use the technologies they want to. Example of that is our HD Insight Hadoop as a service, where we brought that onto the platform rather than creating our own MapReduce service, embracing that open ecosystem, and not just that, but contributing back to it. So we're one of the top contributors to Apache Hadoop. Helping people bring their technologies on the platform through partnering with companies that are open source, like Chef, for example, a great company that we've partnered with to bring Chef integration into the Azure platform deeply so that customers, Chef customers and our customers that want to use Chef can do so easily on Azure. And finally, I think being able to contribute code out into open source, our own code out to open source, to get the innovation from the community to contribute to that source, that technology, as well as to help people use that technology. So especially on the developer-facing front, if you're using a closed developer platform and you run into problems, diagnosing, debugging, fixing those problems becomes problematic. But if it's open, you can go understand the code, you can fix it, you can contribute back. And a great example of that, of course, is .NET and the core CLR, which we've just recently open sourced.
Right. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of technologies. It's a complicated company, a complicated situation. But is it easy to describe, the basic market forces that led to those changes? How did it start at Microsoft and how it evolved?
Yeah, well, it's definitely the use of open source by our customers and also by other people in the software technology space has become, I think, if you look past over the past 15 years, of course, open source has been there for a long time, but we're seeing companies like Gap, enterprise companies that have been our traditional partners that are embracing open source and using a diverse set of open technologies, and we need to meet them where they are. And so that's really kind of the impetus that pushed us. Not just that, but saying, wait a minute, questioning this fundamental premise that we need to build everything ourselves. Also, that was a key one. When we see lots of companies accelerate past us because they're taking advantage of what's out there. Right. And so saying, why can't we do that too? So a couple of those things really have kind of pushed it. And then once we started to look deeply at why are we operating the way we are, what has been holding us back, let's change. And then that kind of opened the floodgates that you see us now just going everywhere with open source. It's no longer taboo. It's actually encouraged in many places. And I can talk a little bit about some of the ways that we're doing that as we get deeper into this. Got it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of that, I guess your, the story you tell started with Azure, right?
Yeah.
And it's an example of how business models have changed, right? And I guess you could relate that to Facebook, right? You don't sell software, you sell a service. And so everything you might do inside of that it can potentially be open source because it's not something that you sell.
Right. Yeah, I mean, every company has their core competency, right? Whether it's your search algorithm or your friend suggestion algorithm or whatever it is, there's always some bits. But from an infrastructure perspective, that's just not our core competency. So why protect that?
So what are the limits of what Facebook then will open source? I mean, how far has it gone? Will it go? And then where does it stop?
I mean, I think so that is a decision that happens from lots of people, right? And it's a big company. So I can't tell you that there's like this exact line where we've drawn it and gone, well, that's the thing, right? But it's an evolving conversation that happens all the time. And there's times when you write something and you say, oh, look, this is what we're basing our entire our entire world on. Maybe we shouldn't open source it. And then you come and you revisit those things, and someone else comes along and says, actually, that's just the foundation. It's what's on top of that. So it's really the core competency. And someone else realizes they were wrong. And so I think, much in the same sense that in continuous integration and delivery, we talk about iterative processes. I think determining what in your business you should be open sourcing is an iterative process, right? Like, I think you're going to constantly come back and your business changes, and which parts of your business are really core and which parts are not, and which parts make sense to share and which parts are factored in a way that is possible to share are going to change as you rewrite that software. So at Facebook, we try really hard to continue to push that line as far as possible. And there's balances. How much time do you have, and what's that team doing, and blah blah blah. But like in general, we try and push it pretty hard.
So Jeff, you're a consumer of open source, as you said. Where is that software coming from? Is it coming from companies like Facebook, or is it coming from vendors who were selling it to you and providing services, or how does it generally work?
I think it starts from the community first. We bring in different tools and ideas. We experiment with them, prototype them. Whether or not we need a vendor to help us maintain them or support them at scale, it just depends upon the tool. It certainly has changed the landscape for us. We're no longer going to large software providers to give us big packages, closed systems. We're looking to write our own systems, leverage open technologies, and stay aligned with the community, because that's where the biggest change is coming from.
So is the biggest change that you're able to try things out before you actually go with them, or that you can take code and incorporate it into your own, or both?
I think the experimentation opens the door for new ideas. It allows more things to happen simultaneously, because you're not locked into vendors and through these long negotiations and contracts before you can really start. So we see innovations starting up inside the stores, online and mobile, in big data analytics. We're experimenting in as many ways possible so we can delight our customers and really compete in the market.
So Mark, you're one of those vendors, so then how can you benefit someone like Jeff, and then in serving someone like Jeff, how does that benefit Microsoft? I mean, in terms of money in the end.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about Azure specifically, since that's where my perspective is closest aligned to. When it comes to a company like The Gap that is looking potentially at a cloud strategic partner, we want to make sure that they're not making a trade-off when they come to us. When it's not, hey, we want to use this technology, we've been using it, but if we go to your cloud, we're going to have to figure out how to use it ourselves, or it's not going to work great on your cloud. But rather, it's a great combination where it's not an either-or, it's an and kind of conversation coming to Azure, where if I'm using Linux, I know that Linux is going to run great on Azure. In fact, the way we see that paying off business-wise with companies like Jeff's is that at this point, over roughly 20% of the VMs deployed on Azure are Linux VMs. And that's kind of, I think, a telling number in terms of how far Microsoft's come embracing an open technology, one that in the past would have just really freaked people out to think about Microsoft running Linux in our cloud. But that enables companies like The Gap, if they're using Linux, to make use of it on Azure and know that Azure is a great place to use Linux.
But I mean, a big part of Microsoft's business is still Windows and still Office and the like. I mean, what does that mean for Windows? I mean, is there a sort of a detriment there for Windows, or?
Well, I think it's really a matter of choice, and we're going to continue to innovate and deliver cool stuff in Windows. You're going to hear about cool stuff coming out in the next few months. We got a lot of cool stuff coming out in Windows. There's lots of customers that we've got, a huge install base that's using Windows, and we want to continue to make them successful on Windows. But again, we see customers that are making other choices, that want to use other technologies, and so Windows is just going to compete on its own merits with these other things, and we're going to make it possible for customers to use whatever technologies they want to use. It's really a matter of really offering the customer the choice and not locking people out of different technologies based on some fundamental choice that they've made at the very start.
So Phil, as someone who's witnessed what Microsoft has done from the outside, what do you think of the transformation? I mean, how far it's gone and how far it...
So I was pretty excited to have Microsoft on the panel, especially as somebody who's anyone who knows me out there, I've said many disparaging things to Microsoft. But no, I think if a company like Microsoft, who's sort of been the antithesis of being part of an open community, can be up here talking about how they give back to the community and why they embrace open choice and understand that, as Mark was saying, forcing somebody to not use this product because they didn't use this product actually hurts them rather than helps them, right? Like, if Microsoft can get that, right, after 30, 40 years, then there's no other company out there who can't get it, right? Like there's nobody in here who can be like, well, but my company is, right? Microsoft gets it, right? So to me, it's powerful as an open source advocate to watch them make that transformation. It makes me super excited.
And what's interesting to me is that it might have begun with Azure, right? And we've talked a lot about that, but it has extended to so many other parts of the business. You mentioned .NET. So in the end, what are the tangible benefits there for Microsoft?
The tangible benefits for Microsoft, I think, well, for .NET, and it goes back to core competencies. It goes back to what's our secret sauce, what are we making money on, what are we delivering differentiation with. For something like .NET, we believe that is an enabling technology that really can get people started on other Microsoft solutions. But it is a valuable asset by itself, just standalone. And so let's make that available. Let's make that free, and let's make sure it works great on Linux as well. The way that helps us is that somebody, hey, if they're going to start using .NET, maybe even if it's on Linux, that they start using Visual Studio to develop and debug .NET. And once they're using Visual Studio, maybe they're using Team Foundation Server or Visual Studio Online, which is an add-on value service for doing integration and DevOps release management. And so that lifts them up into some of our other offerings and makes them candidates for that, where otherwise they might not be. If they're purely on a Linux stack and they're using only Linux technologies that we don't play with at all, then they can't be a customer of ours.
You're right. It works on multiple levels, right? Yeah. You're sharing this with people and giving them a way of using it. But in this case, you're really relying on the community to build a Linux version as well as a Mac version.
That's right.
So you're expanding the reach of this in many different ways. Phil, earlier talked about Facebook open sourcing its hardware through the Open Compute project. Some may not know that Microsoft has also joined this effort.
That's right.
After building its own servers in secret and refusing to talk to me about it for years, the company has now open sourced those designs in much the same way that Facebook has, sharing those with the community, and then also consuming many of those open source designs that are coming from people like Facebook and others. So this can work with hardware as well as software.
Yeah, and that case is an interesting one because again, our secret sauce is the stuff that we add on our cloud platform on top of those servers. By open sourcing that, where it's giving back, it's sharing some of our cool technology that we developed internally with others. But it also comes back to us in a way because once we've open sourced that and we've got OEMs, for example, building on top of that reference model, and our software works great with that reference model, that means that customers that are buying that hardware are going to have a great experience with our software on top of that technology as well. And also it drives the price down, too, of that hardware. If lots of companies are making that hardware, that's going to benefit everybody as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask Phil about this as well, how you see that. A lot of people, when Facebook first open sourced those designs, I can't tell you how skeptical even people in the know were, and a lot of people still are. But have there been tangible benefits for Facebook? What are they? Are they similar to what he just explained there?
There's been in my perspective, a bunch of benefits. So one is working with partners like Microsoft and OCP, and then just being able to share designs and iterate in hardware the way we once did in software is, I think, a huge benefit. As Mark said, it drives costs down, right? So we're not the only people buying these boards and working on these designs. We can go and partner with an OEM to build a server, but if there's a billion other companies out there buying that exact same design through some other standard vendor, then it's cheaper for us. So that's a big benefit. And then the other thing is, it's changed the scene a little bit, I think. Some of you may have seen we recently announced through OCP that we're releasing a bunch of our networking gear as well through OCP. And I think that was enabled because people became comfortable with this idea of sharing hardware. Excuse me. which I think is new in this space, and people are not as comfortable with it, and they don't really know how that works, and the licensing is confusing if you're used to thinking in software terms, and there's all these sort of barriers to entry. And doing that not just as here's one design from Facebook, but doing that as OCP and partnering with lots of other people has garnered a lot of comfort with that throughout the community and internally. Right. So it wasn't, when we wanted to start open sourcing our network designs, it wasn't crazy sauce, right? It was just the next logical step. And so again, we'll be able to start sharing and iterating our network designs with people. That's just awesome. Right. So I think there's massive benefit on both sides of the fence.
Right. So Jeff, as at the Gap, is open source hardware something you could potentially use, either building machines on your own? I imagine that's probably far-fetched, but maybe purchase them through a vendor, right? As Phil alluded to, you've got people like HP and Dell who are now commercializing these same designs.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's a core competency, hardware infrastructure for Gap. We're more of a clothing design company, but we're open to new ideas and new ways of doing business. So I don't think I would limit us on any level about trying something or experimenting or innovating or partnering with anybody to advance our business and do the best we possibly can. Well,
maybe a closer step would be open sourcing some of your own code. Have you discussed that, and where might you go there, and why?
We have. There's lots of people that contribute back to the community and our organization through the Gap and independently. I think we aspire to do more. We're definitely big consumers of it, and we know we need to give back to the community to show respect and to keep the momentum going.
Got it. And so how far, let's start with you, Phil, how far could we take this? I mean, what else could Facebook open source? And what's interesting to me is the new connectivity lab, where the company is building drones and satellites for delivering internet access to kind of the hinterlands or developing parts of the world. I can see the company open sourcing that. Right. ISPs using that sort of hardware.
I mean, I can't speak to the drone project I saw get announced when you did. Right. So there's a lot of stuff that happens in Facebook. But I think that an interesting sort of parallel example to that is we recently open sourced air traffic control, ATC, right. Which is this infrastructure we've been running internally for a really long time, where you can go to a web page internally and be like, I want to know what it's like to be on a dial-up connection in India, right. And like, bam, you get to test an app or a website, right? Those sorts of things. I think it starts with infrastructure, and that's the easiest place to start. Is those little scripts I use to manage this piece or this cookbook or whatever, and you grow and you do things like maybe HHVM, our web server platform, and you work up the stack. And in our case, we ended up also working down the stack to the hardware. And I think it's just a matter of defining better interfaces between your layers, and such in the same way that computer science has been doing for forever. The better you define your layers, the easier it is to rip off the next layer and be like, cool, let's send that out into the world, or oh, cool, somebody wrote a better thing, let's pull that in. And traditionally, people have not done that. Traditionally, people have written big, huge, monolithic, interdependent. But someone here earlier used the term ball of mud, which I think is great. And I think that as we, as infrastructure people, take on more software development practices that have been in the world for a long time and modularize and layer and have interfaces, what we're going to get to is a point where it's so simple and easy to rip out pieces of your infrastructure and open source them that it'll become the default instead of the thing you have to go and try and do. So I think that's where we're getting to. I think that's the goal. I think that's what's down the road.
One area that interests me is the security area. We've talked about a lot of things here. Software infrastructure being open source, things like Hadoop, which Facebook was instrumental in. You talked about Microsoft, picking up the ball there. The length and breadth of the data center has been open source in terms of hardware by Facebook. You mentioned networking gear. One area where we haven't seen a whole lot of movement is security. And Mark, one of your areas of expertise has long been security. You even write novels about it. Where do you see that going? Are we going to see a revolution in terms of open source security software in the same way we've seen it with other data center software?
It's tough for me to say because, as we were discussing a little bit beforehand, there is some open source already in the security community. If you take a look at forensics tools, if you look at intrusion detection, vulnerability scanners, Metasploit's a classic example, that there's already a ton of open source kind of at the bottom layers of security. Now, when you get into higher levels of security and security monitoring and analytics, that's a place where I think there's a lot of differentiation going on right now. And so that's not in the commodity stage yet. So I think you'll see companies keeping stuff closed there. Again, when it goes to core competencies and delivering differentiated value that you can sell and make money off of, that there's going to be an effort there. At the same time, I expect that you'll see an open offering in that same space that will mature and become a compelling alternative as well, which is kind of the model that we see in a lot of these spaces, even when there's some core differentiated value coming from some companies that are choosing to go closed, there's open alternatives that are there innovating and actually pushing the whole industry together to get more creative and more differentiated, which is just in the end a great result for everybody. So I think we will see that evolve that way.
Got it. I also want to add something, if you don't mind. I think that there was one of the keynotes actually mentioned this as well. I think the thing that's changing with the DevOps mentality is we're starting to think about security not as a separate piece. It's not, I have my infrastructure and I have my security and I have my software. It's, I have my infrastructure and I have my software, and that's it, because I have defined my ACLs in my infrastructure. I have defined my security requirements in my software, and they get delivered at the same time. Always, right? So I think part of what's going to happen as we move forward is security is not going to be the third pillar. It's just going to merge into the other two pillars. And then, well, that's a really bad analogy. It sounds very unstable. But you know what I'm saying, right? Like, I think that's going to be not a separate piece.
I see what you're saying, but I guess security is a bit different in that you're trying to protect your infrastructure from miscreants, right? There's certain information you don't want them to have. That said, Facebook recently open sourced a tool called OS Query, and what Joe Sullivan, your head of security, will say is that when you're building a service, and this is the way the world is going, when you're building a service that large, it's hard to use kind of the commercial software that's out there to protect your infrastructure. Just as it's hard to build something the size of Facebook with traditional commercial software. Facebook was forced to build their own tool. Basically, this tool is a way of querying the OS to see what has changed, to see if there might have been an attack. But it is such a complex problem. They've open sourced this. They're getting people like Etsy, of all companies, to contribute. They're already contributing. And they really see this as a way things could go potentially. And then, as with other things, I guess you could see companies take that and commercialize it, right? And share it with the rest of the world. Have you thought much about, Jeff, about open source security? Is that?
We think about security every day. It's very important to our business and to our customers. We stay connected in the community and privately with our with partners around the globe to secure our enterprise. It's at the forefront as we build new technologies and we're out there innovating. We're always thinking security at the same time. It's a critical part of retail.
Got it.
They have credit card numbers. They have to think security.
Right. Got it. Is that potentially, Mark, something that Microsoft could contribute to? Do you know? Do they build their own security software, I imagine?
Like you were mentioning for Facebook, running security operations at scale and the security systems that go with a DevOps model at scale is something that right now is not, you can't buy it off the shelf. So we're building a lot of our own stuff, and at this point, what we've got in mind is making that technology available to our customers as well. Again, when it comes to just like Facebook's processes of when you've got software that you're going to make available, you go through now a very deliberate discussion of, hey, should we make it open right now? Or is there still some differentiated value here? Or is it ready to be open? I mean, because there's, you've got to get the code into a state where it's actually consumable in an open nature, right? Writing code for your own internal use, right. If you make it open and it's got a lot of it's poor architecture, lots of undefined assumptions in the code, then it becomes very hard for anybody to understand what the code is doing or to contribute back to it, and then what's the point of opening it? So there is this process now that we go through deliberately for everything. So I will say, yeah, we're constantly, for every piece of software that we develop at this point, it's on the table. Do we make it open?
There was a quote at a panel last year where someone said there's production ready and then there's GitHub ready. I think it's a great example of that.
The other thing that interests me is we talk about not being able to even build something like Facebook or Azure without the open source software that's out there that you have to, or without building your own, right? Many times when I talk about this idea, people are skeptical and they say, well, that might make sense for a Facebook. It might make sense for a Microsoft, right? They're so large and they're forced to do this. But how many of those companies are there, right? How many companies are going to face those problems? How many companies are going to use, for instance, a security tool that Microsoft has to build to protect its operation? But it's always seemed to me that as time goes on, we're going to have more and more companies of that size, right? You're going to have more and more people who need the stuff that Facebook has built or that Microsoft has built. Is that indeed the case?
That's the way that I approach it inside of Microsoft. There has been these discussions of, we're building this software. Who else operates at Bing scale, out there? Right. And it turns out there's not that many, right? You can count them on a few hands at most. Right. But as you point out, I think that you'll see more and more companies operating at that kind of scale. Even though they're not large companies, their infrastructure, their data, the number of applications they've got, that's going to be operating at that kind of scale. And for us to say we're building software only for this niche group, I think kind of locks us out of opportunities, future opportunities. Not only that, but we also have to think about, can we scale this down? Can we have the solution scale down so that it can address the needs of the guys that are on the smaller end of the scale today, that could be large tomorrow, but even if not, that can address their needs as well. So instead of just focusing on for our own internal use, and there's no value in making sure that it's consumable outside.
I think I hear that a lot when I'm talking to people in the community. Oh, we don't need this. We don't need automation. We have 5 servers. We don't need that level of automation because we only have 50 or 100 servers or whatever. And the argument I constantly make to people is, if you've automated and you have nothing else to do, then you can go to the beach and your world is better, right? There's literally no level of scale where you don't want automation. And the same thing holds true here for any other sort of tool. If we build these tools right, it doesn't matter whether you have hundreds of thousands of servers or you have just a few servers, right? Like, you want the tools that are going to enable you to not have to worry about how many you have ever, right? Like, I think that's where we all, as a community, are trying to get to with these discussions and these tools. To be in a world where you can go from 1 to 1 million, and it doesn't. Yes, you're going to have to buy some infrastructure, and yes, you're going to have to think about things somewhat differently, but where you don't go, well, I use the one set of tools from 1 to 5, and the other set of tools from 5 to 50, and the next set of tools for 50 to 1,000, and like, that sucks, right? Like, let's not do that. And then the other piece that kind of Mark alluded to, but I think it's worth mentioning, is if Facebook and Microsoft and Gap and Amazon all use one set of tools and everyone else in the room is using a different set of tools, we don't get to learn from you and you don't get to learn from us. And like, we're not the only smart people in the world, right? Like, everyone in this room is smart and contributes to this community in a wonderful way. And I don't want to work in a silo of not you guys, right? I want to work in the community with you guys, where you guys can be like, hey, Facebook, you're doing this thing and it's great, but oh my God, you can do it better. So I think in that sense, we all want to build tools that we can use at any size.
I wanted to make a comment. I think the tools are one way to bring us together, but it's the community and talent and the individual engineers in this room that are really driving the change, and especially in big enterprises that were really, operating in a different way, in a more closed door way.
Yep.
For us, for companies at our scale and startups, you have to be open to everyone's idea, listening to what the community is, and following that passion. And that's the differentiator. It's the people who make the tools.
Yep.
Got it. But given what Mark and Phil have said, Jeff, how do you view your operation relative to to a Facebook? When Facebook is open sourcing these types of things, are you following what they're doing? Are you saying that could benefit me down the road? Do you see them as just as a completely different animal, or how do you view them?
No, we see them we see these large-scale IT companies as thought leaders. We want to be in that same group, at that same level, at that same excellence. We aspire to be as best as we can, and we get better when companies like Facebook, Microsoft, Chef push the envelope, push the scale, push things beyond what people believe is actually possible, and we're right there to follow and to leverage that for our own business.
Well, speaking of perception, Mark, one of the other things that intrigues me about Microsoft's evolution is that, as we've shown, they have evolved. As you said, you can now run Linux on Azure. But to what extent do you also need to change the perception of people out there? Are there companies that what type of company is willing to wants to run Linux on Azure? Are they going to use something that is more traditionally associated with open source? Is that another hump to get over?
It is, and that's why I'm actually here in this panel. It's actually I still run into customers where I tell them you can run Linux on Azure. In fact, there's a bunch of distros that are supported, and they say, really? I didn't know that. And so we've got a history to work past, and that means that we're out there beating the drums as much as we can, so that it's not to thump our chest and say, look, we get it now. It is to let people know that we get it, in a sense that they're going to consider Microsoft if they are running Linux, instead of just automatically saying, oh, I'm running Linux, well, which clouds do I pick from? And the Microsoft one is immediately not on that list. So I think that is still something that we have a lot of work to do on.
So you say 20% of Azure now runs on Linux. I mean, who are those companies that are doing that today? Are they typically running a mix of machines, Windows and Linux? Or?
Yeah, a lot of companies are a mix. So of course, startups traditionally are just start right out on Linux and they stay on Linux. And we've got a bunch of startups that are on Azure, just purely Linux. If you look at any enterprise right now, I mean, how many enterprises in here are pure Windows only? Let's get a raise of hands. And I don't see any hands, or just a few. One hand, thank you. Two. But I mean, that's the reality that we live in today. So a lot of the Linux on us are from enterprises, because the enterprises are running Windows and Linux today.
So when you're talking to this crowd, right? We got one person who runs just Windows. What is the reason then to use you as opposed to using something else?
Well, I think, like I said, we want to make it so that Linux isn't a factor in that decision. It's like, okay, Microsoft runs Linux great, and I get to run the version of Linux I want to. I know that it's going to be supported on Azure. At that point, it's a higher level story, and there's a whole bunch of factors that goes into it. Who you're going to pick for your strategic cloud partner that is able to deliver the global reach that you want, the partner ecosystem that you want, the services that you want, a great platform for the other technologies that you're using. Right. Of course, if you're using Windows, who's going to run Windows the best? All right. That's potentially another consideration. So it's a whole bunch of factors, but we just want to make sure that it's these things like, I'm using this particular technology and it's open. So that means that Microsoft is automatically in or out, or I've got questions about it. It's no, we are open for business and choice, and let's make the decisions based on other differentiators.
So as you've shown quite well, the world has changed, and as a result, Microsoft has changed. And when you talk about how far this could go, I mean, given those changes, could Microsoft eventually open source Windows? I mean, given the way that things have changed.
It's definitely possible. Like I said, it's a new Microsoft, and literally every conversation you can imagine about what should we do with our software, open, not open services, it's happened.
I see. I guess that's a very difficult thing to deal with politically, but I guess it's also difficult to deal with technically, right? Something that has been
absolutely. We talked about some of the challenges with things like that. Like, you can open source something, but it comes with a build system that is takes rocket scientists and 3 months to set up, then what's the point? Yeah.
Right, got it. It's a fascinating idea to think about, and you wonder, to what, I mean, let's say you did make a decision like that, to what lengths you would have to go to make sure it was ready. It's not as easy as just throwing something, over the transom.
Actually, if you go back like 10 years, before I was even at Microsoft, there's an academic version of Windows, the core part of Windows, that is the source code available to academics to do research on. The academic, I can't remember what the offering is called.
Right, okay.
But this is before I showed up at Microsoft, though I was involved with it because I was, as my previous job kind of as a Windows internals guy, writing a curriculum resource kit for academia that would go with it. And I saw Microsoft go through this process of, we got to, first of all, get rid of all the profanity. Everybody has got to do that with their code. Then also then go check everything for IP issues, right? We don't want to get anybody into trouble by giving them this, making this code available to them. We want to make sure they're protected, we're protected, and that is a process as well as you go through that. And then how do you get it, something that they can build? So there is a process that you go through. And in fact, Microsoft is systemically making it possible for us to do this in a very natural, organic, grassroots way now. We've got an internal resource that I helped launch, open source. It's an internal URL where developers can go and they can get guidance on, if I want to use open source, what do I got to think about? If I want to contribute code to open source, here's how do I go about doing it? Where can I find open source? What other groups in the company are using open source and what are they using? So if I want to use an open source product, who can I go to for help? So that's an internal resource that we've created to help people go through this process without it being, from scratch every time we do it.
I guess in its own way, that shows how much Microsoft has changed, because as you indicated, this is an evolution that spans many, many years, right? It's not as if you just flipped a switch. The company, in various ways, has had to evolve.
But it's definitely a massive acceleration. In fact, if we've got this public opensource.microsoft.com, if you go to that, you can see all of the code that we've contributed to open source, all in GitHub, of course, because that's the place where the cool kids put their open source. But you can find the full catalog, and there's over 1,000 now repos there that we've got, that we've contributed. SDKs, of course, .NET and the CLR are there, and ASP.NET is there.
That's a good point. Microsoft still runs its own open source hub, Codeplex, and that's been around for years, and that's where you traditionally, would open source things. .NET, it was straight to GitHub.
And same thing with our Azure SDKs, even before that.
Oh, I see. Got it. Google has moved the same way. Google has actually closed down its open source hub, Google Code, because it just uses GitHub as well. Is that where Facebook open sources? I imagine almost all of its code.
All of our code is on GitHub. I mean, we have code.facebook.com, so you can search our offerings, because they're across a variety of repos, of course. So it's more of an index and some tooling around finding the right licenses or the right code bases. But yeah, all of our code is on GitHub.
I mean, is there anything else is SourceForge still, on people's radar? But Bitbucket, or is it pretty much GitHub where everything's happened?
I think people are generally converging on GitHub, but I mean, I certainly have interacted with most of the projects you just mentioned. I've interacted with SourceForge lately. I've interacted with Bitbucket lately, and a bunch of these other ones. So, I mean, I think it sort of depends on what your use case is, but certainly GitHub is by far the largest at this point.
Well, we've come to the end here. Thanks all three of you for chatting. My one regret is that there wasn't more disagreement, but I guess that's just another sign of the way things have changed. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.